to wartime flying. You eventually accept it as the norm.
So were you not scared of dying?
Not really. There seemed to be more important things, to be honest. The job seemed to be more important than being worried about dying. I think the only time I was scared in the air was when I saw all the guys shooting at me from Stanley Airport. That, for a fraction of a second, scared me. The only other time that I felt huge concern was when I was in the ship and I knew there was an exocet coming for us, and there was nothing I could do. Just pull the old anti-flash on, hang on to my pint of beer and see what happened. And that was not a nice feeling. John Locke was great, but he gave us a little bit too much information on that occasion, sort of giving the countdown to the impact of the missile, but it hit Atlantic Conveyor instead. Yeah, it was launched at Hermes. We turned downwind, fired chaff, and the missile was pulled off us by the chaff and picked up the next big target, which was the Atlantic Conveyor, which happened to be the third most important ship in the fleet, actually.
It was carrying troops and supplies.
Yeah, helicopters, supplies, fuel, bombs, and what we thought was all the Harrier strip that was going to be laid at San Carlos. So we thought we'd lost all the strip, but in fact they managed to cobble together 600 feet or 650 feet or something of strip from other ships.
The sort of observant amongst the listeners would probably think, well, you've got vertical takeoff capability, but presumably that there's a weight limit to that. That's why you'd need a landing strip or a takeoff strip.
Yeah, absolutely. On a good cold day using water injection, you could probably, off the top of my head, get airborne with 2,500 pounds of fuel, something like that. So that's 20 minutes flying vertically. Whereas if you use a 650-foot runway, you can get airborne with 6,500 pounds of fuel. So you've got got an hour's flying.
There was a chapter, I think, in your book where you talk about attacking, was it the Narwhal? The Argentinian, yeah. It's a fishing boat that's been sequestered and turned into an intelligence gathering ship, isn't it? Can you describe that experience?
Yes, that was all a bit of a surprise. I went off with a chap called Gordy Batt, who was a delightful character, a brilliant guy. He'd been on an exchange tour in the States flying these sixes, I think. Brilliant sense of humour. I was leading him for some reason, I can't remember why, because he was very experienced and I was a new boy. But we went out with 1,000-pound bomb centerline and 2 missiles. And the idea was we'd drop the bombs on the airfield from high altitude, just using a point measured from the center of the runway for the forward flight of the bomb from whatever it was, 20,000 feet. Not using any weapon aiming as such, but just to keep the boys on the ground on their toes by having the odd 1,000-pound egg dropping in the middle every so often. But we were told by the captain not to drop unless we could see the airfield, and there was cloud cover over the airfield, so we turned out on our cap station down to the southeast of Stanley, and I flashed up my radar and found a surface contact. So we let down together through the overcast. It was only a few hundred feet cloud base. Came out of the bottom, ran in towards the target. Gordy moved out about 1,000 yards on my left in a good battle formation. And I saw the ship and said, we'll do a crossover over the ship, see if we can identify it. And I went straight in from the starboard side of the ship, and Bertie came around behind me to go fore and aft, and I got the name as I went past and called it back to the ship that was controlling us. I said it's called the Narwhal, and Gordy said, and it's got a bloody great RG flag on it. So I sent this back, and about 30 seconds later, the controller came back to us and said, engage it, which was a bit of a surprise, because as far as I could see, it was just a stern trawler. But having said that, the nets were all very neatly stowed on the deck. There was no sign of any fishing. So I said to Gordy, okay, we'll engage it with guns, but let's get rid of the bombs first, because we couldn't land back on board with 1,000 pounders. At least they didn't want us to, in case we had a bit of a nasty on the deck. So we set up. I came in from the starboard side and did a bit of sort of mini pull-up and released the bomb, and then turned away, and I saw it go between the bridge and the derricks on the stern and hit the water beyond it. Gordy came in from the bow, and we didn't see what happened to his bomb. But in fact, it went into the forecastle and down 2 decks and ended up in the forward heads. Unfortunately, one of the crew members was in there. Didn't do him much good. But neither of them went off because they were fused for high-level drop with about an 11-second fuse before they armed, and we knew they wouldn't go off from low level. We then went around. I said, okay, follow me round and we'll do some strafe. Once again, the cloud base was very low for strafe. You normally want to get a nice 10-degree dive because the guns on the Harrier actually point a few degrees upwards, and we couldn't do that. So I just did a level attack, starting with the guns high and then bunting, pulling the trigger and walking the rounds up the side of the ship. And in fact, because I fired at quite long range, I saw my first round starting to hit the ship as I pulled the nose up to recover. I then noticed a dark shape coming in the opposite direction with sparkles underneath it, and it was Gordy. He lost me visually and decided to attack anyway, and we did a 180 out attack on the ship and a sort of red arrows pass over the top. God knows how we didn't get shrapnel from each other. Anyway, he then fell in behind me. I did another attack from the bow, and then he did an attack and actually hit the front of the bridge with probably, I don't know, 15 or 20 rounds. Just lit up the whole of the bridge. And at that stage, the ship... Oh, I forgot to say, Gordy actually fired shots across the bow while I was still coming back down, having talked to the controller, and the ship didn't stop. But when he actually hit the bridge, it stopped. So we then went back to Hermes, and the position was passed on to Invincible, Invincible, who launched a Sea King full of special forces the idea was to capture it and use it to insert special forces. But when they got there, they found that the engine room was a complete mess because the 30mm had gone straight through the side of the ship and taken out the engines. So they let it sink. Took the crew back to Invincible. Discovered there was only one Argentine naval officer on board, Lieutenant Commander, who was in civis, but immediately admitted who he was and was placed in solitary confinement, locked in a cabin, and he assumed he was going to be shot as a spy because he was in civilian clothes. And the only guy on the ship who spoke decent Spanish was the Roman Catholic padre. So they sent the padre along, and he saw the padre coming in and thought, oh, that's it, I'm going to get my confession and then they're going to shoot me. But we disembarked them to Montevideo several days later, I think.
If you enjoyed this clip and want more, you can go to 10percenttrue.com, hit subscribe, you get early ad-free access to all my content. Appreciate your support.